Hello, everyone. Oh, it's very dark in here. Bob, don't go! Bob! Bob, no! I was trying not to move, and I moved, and I disturbed the kitty. Oh, well. Hello. Let's see here. I'm using my crappy mic today because the other mic seems to have gone and given up the ghost, but I have a new one coming soon. Until then, we are back with The Lord of the Rings. Well, technically, the Silmarillion. Let's see, last time we finished the Alcalabeth. This time we're reading the last chapter, which is, let's see, yeah, it's just that many pages. The rest is all index and family trees and things. Hello, Daniel, Don, Jeff, Alice, Lobsel, thanks for joining us as we finish our first book reading. It'll be entirely done, the first one we've fully finished reading. I'm so proud. Sorry I haven't had that many streams this week. It has been a wild up and down week with decorating Christmas and dealing with family and whew, but hopefully soon going back to normal. Until then, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in which these tales come to their end. Of old there was Sauron the Maya, whom the Sindar in Beleriand named Gorthar. In the beginning of Arda, Melkor seduced him to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms, and for long, if he willed, he could still appear noble and beautiful, so as to deceive all but the most wary. When Thangorodrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again, and did obeisance to Yonwe, the herald of Manwe, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the West. But it was not within the power of Yonwe to pardon those of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aman and receive the judgment of Manwe. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith. For under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore, when Yonwe departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. Can we do a Lord of the Rings watch soon? We sure can. I'm thinking we should watch them maybe next weekend, we'll see. Because I'm sure my niece would love to join that. She likes those movies a lot. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorodrim, there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the east, in Osiriand, the walls of Ered Luin were broken, and a great gap was made in them towards the south, and a gulf of the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lune fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lune. That country had of old been named Lindon by the Noldor, and this name it bore thereafter. And many of the Eldar still dwelt there, lingering, unwilling yet to forsake Beleriand, where they had fought and laboured long. Gil-galad, son of Fingon, was their king, and with him was Elrond half-elven, son of Erendiel the Mariner, and brother of Elros, first king of Númenor. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Lune the elves built their havens, and named them Mithlond, and there they held many ships, for the harbourage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever and anon set a sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth. For by the mercy of the Valar the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Eresia and Valinor, beyond the encircling seas. Others of the Eldar there were, who crossed the mountains of Ered Luin in that age, and passed into the inner lands. Many of these were Teleri, survivors of Doriath and Osiriand, and they established realms among the Sylvan elves, in woods and mountains far from the sea, for which none the less they ever yearned in their hearts. Only in a region, where men called Holland, did elves of Nodoran race establish a lasting realm beyond Ered Luin. Eregion was nigh to the great mansions of the dwarves that were named Khazad-dûm, but by the elves called Hadhodron, and afterwards Moria. From Austin Edhill, the city of the elves, the high road ran to the west gate of Khazad-dûm, for a friendship arose between elves and dwarves, such as has never elsewhere been, to the enrichment of both those people. In Eregion, the craftsmen of Gwathi-Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, surpassed in cunning all that had ever been wrought, save only Fëanor himself. And indeed greatest in skill among them was Celebrimbor, son of Carufin, who was estranged from his father and remained in Nagathrond when Celegorm and Carufin were driven forth, as is told in the Quenta Silmarillion. Fun story. We're getting to the part of the history that's covered in the video games, Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. One of the characters in that game is Celebrimbor, and his history is a really big part of the story. We will stream it one day, because it's one of my favorite games of all time. Elsewhere in Middle-earth there was peace for many years, yet the lands were for the most part savage and desolate, save only where the people of Beleriand came. Many elves dwelt there indeed, as they had dwelt through the countless years, wandering free in the wide lands far from the sea. But they were Avari, to whom the deeds of Beleriand were but a rumour, and Valinor only a distant name. And in the south and in the further east men multiplied, and most of them turned to evil, for Sauron was at work. Seeing the desolation of the world, Sauron said in his heart that the Valar, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Númenor, who came back at whiles in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled this mind, and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth. He's confusing me, because now and again he's referring to Middle-earth as just Earth. Long he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon did he not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware. For Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them, Alas for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eresia, and maybe even Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of the power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, for in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return into the west, and desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and they yet to enjoy the bliss of those they departed. Therefore they hearkened to Sauron, and learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smiths of Austin Edhill surpassed all they'd contrived before, and they took thought, and they made rings of power. Dun dun dun. But Sauron guided their labours, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves, and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, For the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow. And while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser things, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. So the movies and the original books themselves kind of skim over the bit where the one ring to rule them all rules the others. Like, it says they made rings, blah, but it doesn't really go into why. And it's because Sauron's the one that taught them how to make rings. He was there the whole time, kind of like if it was a computer program. He's going behind them, watching their code and counter-programming to put his virus in there so that he can do what he wants with the rings. He can control their minds, he can control their magic, and as soon as his ring's destroyed, all their rings are useless. The elves were not so lightly to be caught. As soon as Sauron set the one ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived he would be master of them, and all they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings. But he, finding he was betrayed and the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved and bore away and hid them. Now these were the 3 that had last been made, and they possessed the greatest powers. Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, they were named, the rings of fire, and of water, and of air, set with ruby, and adamant, and sapphire, and of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them, for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. But Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly while Sauron kept the ruling ring. Therefore the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron never touched them, yet they were also subject to the one. 3 of the elven rings, even though Sauron was around and doing his messing around, he never got to touch them. Celebrimbor made them by himself. Sauron can still sense them, he can kind of, manipulate them, but he doesn't have as much control over these 3. So the elves managed to save these 3 and sneak them away and hide them. They don't use them necessarily because that would kind of be like sending a signal flare to Sauron, but they keep them, and it helps to keep some places safe. Galadriel has one. I think she has the air. That keeps Lothlorien safe. That's why that elven area is so great. Elrond has another. I think he has water. That's why Rivendell's never been attacked and is safe. And the last one is Gandalf's. I think Gandalf has the Ring of Fire. From the time of war never ceased between Sauron and the elves, and Eregion was laid waste, Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. In that time, the stronghold and refuge of Imladris, that men called Rivendell, was founded by Elrond half-elven, and long it endured. Notice that the 3 rings go to be hidden in safety at the same time Elrond just happens to found a safe haven that never falls. Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them to other people of Middle-earth, thus hoping to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this matter, as all others, readiest to his will. And all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily since he'd had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold was kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. So the 7 dwarves, dwarf kings, get the 7 rings, but dwarven spirits are really strong. They are hard to control. He can't control their minds. He has trouble influencing them that way, but he's able to influence their weakness, which is the love of treasure and gold, and so anyone that has those rings or any gold is a big weakness for dwarves, which is part of why The Hobbit ends the way it does. Thorin is one of the descendants of one of the dwarven kings that inherited a ring. Let's see here. Men proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the One, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgul they were, the ring-wraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased until he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the elves, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Numenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. A mask he still could wear, so that if he wished he might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail, and those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and named him the Enemy. And he gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command and multiplied like flies. Thus the black years began, which the elves call the days of flight. In that time many of the elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over the seas, never to return, and many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon Gil-galad still maintained his power, and Sauron dared not as yet to pass the mountains of Ered Luin, nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Númenóreans. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south well nigh all men were under his domain, and they grew strong in those days, and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Now, it says here that he summons, like, all the dark forces that were Morgoth's to him, and they all, like, serve him. If I remember correctly, specifically the big guys, the Balrogs, refuse. The Balrogs are like, nah, you are not cool enough, we are not serving you, and they just keep napping. They just chill. I don't think they answered the call. Which is why one of them was still in Moria. Yet there came at length a stay in the onslaught of Sauron upon the Westlands, for as it is told in the Akallabeth, he was challenged by the might of Numenor. Oh, my allergies have been so bad lately. I'm allergic to dust, and putting out all these Christmas ornaments and trees and things has just shifted all the dust. Okay. So great was the power and splendor of the Númenóreans in the noontide of their realm, that the servants of Sauron would not withstand them, and hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, he left Middle-earth for a while, and went to Numenor as a hostage of Tar-Calion the king. Don't think the dragons did either. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right there. I don't think any dragons fought with Sauron. There he abode until at last by his craft he had corrupted the hearts of most of that people, and set them at war with the Valar, and so compassed their ruin, as he had long desired. But that ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. The world was broken, and the land was swallowed up, and the seas rose over it, and Sauron himself went down into the abyss. But his spirit arose and fled back on a dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. There he found the power of Gil-galad had grown great in the years of his absence, and it was spread now over wide regions of the north and west, and had passed beyond the misty mountains and the great river, even to the borders of Greenwood the Great, and was drawing nigh to the strong places where once he had dwelt secure. Then Sauron withdrew to his fortress in the Black Land and meditated war. So, the reason that he seems to be mostly this kind of incorporeal spirit a lot of the time, he accidentally got his original body dunked in the ocean, and he hasn't had a real physical body since. Alright. In that time, those of the Númenóreans who were saved from destruction fled eastward, as is told in the Alcalabeth. The chief of these were Elendil the Tall, and his sons Isildur and Anarion. Kinsmen of the king they were, descendants of Elros, but they had been unwilling to listen to Sauron and had refused to make war on the lords of the west. Manning their ships with all who remained faithful, they forsook the land of Númenor ere ruin came upon it. They were mighty men, and their ships were strong and tall. But the tempests overtook them, and they were borne aloft on hills of water, even to the clouds, and they descended upon Middle-earth like birds of the storm. Elendil was cast up by the waves in the land of Lindon, and he was befriended by Gil-galad. Thence he passed up the river Lune, and beyond Ered Luin he established his realm, and his people dwelt in many places in Eriador, and the courses of the Lune and the Barad-dûn, and his chief city was at Annunumas, beside the water of Lake Nunyal, at Fornost, upon the North Downs. Also the Númenóreans dwelt, and in Cardolan, and the hills of Rudar, and the towers they raised upon Emen-Beriad, and upon Amon-Sul, and there remain many barrows and ruined works in those places, but the towers of Emen-Beriad still look towards the sea. So basically, we're at where Middle-earth in the movies is now. The northern section is a bunch of ruins where these guys came and built castles, and then eventually they fall and die too. I remember Fornost and the North Downs because when I was in college playing the Lord of the Rings online game, I did a lot of side quests in that area. Aw, thanks for the support, Daniel. Isildur and Anarion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships up the great river Anduin, that flows out of Rhovanion into the western sea in the bay of Belfalas, and they established a realm in those lands that were after called Gondor, whereas the northern kingdom was called Arnor. Long before, in the days of their power, the mariners of Númenor had established a haven and strong places about the mouth of Anduin, in despite of Sauron in the Black Land that lay nigh upon the east. In the later days to this haven came only the faithful of Númenor, and many therefore of the folk of the coastlands in that region were in whole or part akin to the elf friends and the people of Elendil, and they welcomed his sons. The chief city of the southern realm was Osgiliath, through the midst of which a great river flowed. And the Númenóreans built there a great bridge, upon which there were towers and houses of stone wonderful to behold, and tall ships came up out of the sea to the quays of the city. Other strong places they built also upon either hand, Minas Ithil, the tower of rising moon, eastward upon a shoulder of the mountains of shadow as a threat to Mordor, and into the westward Minas Anor, the tower of the setting sun, at the feet of Mount Mindoluin, as a shield against the wild men of the dales. In Minas Ithil was the house of Isildur, and in Minas Arnor the house of Anarion, but they shared the realm between them, and their thrones were set side by side in the great hall of Osgiliath. These are all places in the third movie. Third movie. These were the chief dwellings of the Númenóreans in Gondor, but other works were marvelous and strong they built in the land in the days of their power, at the Argonath, and at Algarond, and at Eric, and in the circle of Angrenost, which men called Isengard, they made the pinnacle of Orthanc of unbreakable stone. Many treasures and great heirlooms of virtue and wonder the exiles had brought from Númenor, and of these the most renowned were the 7 stones and the white tree. The white tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the Fair that stood in the courts of the kings at Armanellos in Numenor, ere Sauron burned it. And Nimloth was in turn descended from the tree of Tirion, that was an image of the eldest of trees, white Telperion, which Yavanna caused to grow in the land of the Valar. The tree, memorial of the Eldar and the light of Valinor, was planted in Minas Ithil, before the house of Isildur, since he it was that saved the fruit from destruction. But the stones they divided. 3 Elendil took, and his sons each 2. Those of Elendil were set in towers upon Emen-Bered and upon Amon-Sul, in the city of these are so hard to say. Minas. But those of his sons were at Minas Ithil and Minas Arnor, and at Orthanc, and in Osgiliath. Now these stones had the virtue that those who looked therein might perceive in them things far off, whether in place or in time. For the most part they revealed only things near to another kindred stone, for the stones each called to each. But those who possessed great strength of will and mind might learn to direct their gaze whither they would. Thus the Númenóreans were aware of many things their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. That is also in the movie. Sauron has one, which he's in a tower that they built and put a rock in. I wouldn't wonder if it was there when he took over the tower. It is said that the towers of Emen-Bered were not built indeed by the exiles of Númenor, but were raised by Gil-galad for Elendil, his friend, and the seeing stone of Emen-Bered was set in Elostirion, the tallest of the towers. Thither Elendil would repair, and thence he would gaze out over the sundering seas, where the yearning of exile was upon him, and it is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away even the tower of Avalone upon Aresia, where the Master Stone abode, and yet abides. These stones were gifts of the Eldar to Amandil, father of Elendil, for the comfort of the faithful of Númenor in their darker days, where the elves might come no longer to the land under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar, but all those that were brought to Middle-earth long ago were lost. So, there was originally a stone over in the elf land, the immortal land that all the elves eventually planned to go to, and they gave the other stones to the men thinking that, hey, when we can't see each other any longer, we'll telephone! And then Sauron took them all. Thus the exiles of Númenor established their realms in Arnor and Gondor, but ere many years had passed it became manifest that their enemy Sauron had also returned. He came in secret, as has been told, to his ancient kingdom of Mordor beyond the Eifel-Duath, the Mountains of Shadow, and that country marched with Gondor upon the east. There above the valley of Gorgoroth was built his fortress vast and strong, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, and there was a fiery mountain in that land that the elves named Orodruin. Indeed, for that reason, Sauron had set there his dwelling long before, for he used that fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and his forging. And in the midst of the land of Mordor he fashioned the ruling ring. There now he brooded in the dark until he had wrought for himself a new shape, and it was terrible, for his fair semblance had departed forever when he was cast into the abyss at the drowning of Númenor. He took up again the great ring and clothed himself in power, and the malice of the eye of Sauron few even of the great among elves and men could endure. Now Sauron prepared war against the Eldar and the men of Westernesse, and the fires of the mountain were wakened again. Wherefore, seeing the smoke of Orodruin from afar, and perceiving Sauron had returned, the Númenóreans named that mountain anew Amon Amarth, which is Mount Doom. And Sauron gathered to him great strength of his servants out of the east and south, and among them were not a few of the high race of Númenor. For in the days of the sojourn of Sauron in that land, the hearts of well-nigh all its people had been turned towards darkness. Therefore many of those who sailed east in that time and made fortresses and dwellings upon the coast were already bent to his will, and they served him still gladly in Middle-earth. But because of the power of Gil-galad, these renegades, lords both mighty and evil, for the most part took up their abodes in the southlands far away. Yet two there were, Hurumor and Fuinir, who rose to power among the Haradrim, a great and cruel people that dwelt in the wide lands south of Mordor beyond the mouths of Anduin. It's stupid. The Haradrim are the desert people, and he only ever talks about them to say, they were all evil! It's not necessary. These two desert lords sucked. Okay, they joined Sauron. When therefore Sauron saw his time, he came with great force against the new realm of Gondor, and he took Minas Ithil, and he destroyed the white tree of Isildur that grew there. But Isildur escaped, and taking with him a seedling of the tree, he went with his wife and sons by ship down the river, and they sailed from the mouths of Anduin, seeking Elendil. Meanwhile Anarion held Osgiliath against the enemy, and for that time drove him back to the mountains. But Sauron gathered his strength again, and Anarion knew that unless help should come, his kingdom would not long stand. Now Elendil and Gil-galad took counsel together, for they perceived Sauron would go true strong and would overcome all his enemies one by one if they did not unite against him. Therefore they made that league which is called the Last Alliance, and they marched east into Middle-earth, gathering a great host of elves and men. And they halted for a while at Imladris. It is said that the host there were assembled was fairer and more splendid in arms than any that has been since in Middle-earth, and none greater has been mustered since the host of the Valar went against Thangorodrim. From Imladris they crossed the Misty Mountains by many passes, and marched down the river Anduin, and so came at last upon the host of Sauron on Dargalad, the battle plain, which lies before the gate of the Black Land. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. Hey, Ratch! Fun story. That whole paragraph inspired me to write an entire fan fiction. I shouldn't describe it much because it would be so easy to find because it's like the only one of its kind. But when I was in college, I read that and it said all living things were divided except elves. And I was like, wait, does that mean that there were good orcs? And so I wrote a fan fiction about good orcs. Anyway. The hosts of Gil-galad and Elendil had the victory, for the might of the elves was still great in those days, and the Númenóreans were strong and tall and terrible in their wrath. Against Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad, none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and the moon, and was named Narsil. Then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years, and suffered grievous loss by fire and by the darts and bolts of the enemy, and Sauron sent many sorties against them. There in the valley of Gorgoroth, Anarion, son of Elendil, was slain, and many others. But at last the siege was so strait that Sauron himself came forth, and he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil, and they both were slain. And the sword of Elendil broke under him as he fell. But Sauron, who was also thrown down, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur cut the ruling ring from the hand of Sauron and took it for his own. Then Sauron was, for that time, vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. The movie does not make it look like it's a 7-year siege, huh? It took a long time. Thus began the third age of the world, after the eldest days and the black years. And there was still hope in that time, and the memory of mirth. And for long the white tree of the Eldar flowered in the courts of the kings of men, for the seedling which he had saved Isildur planted in the citadel of Arnor, in memory of his brother ere he departed from Gondor. The servants of Sauron were routed and dispersed, yet they were not wholly destroyed, and though many men turned now from evil and became subject to the heirs of Elendil, yet many more remembered Sauron in their hearts and hated the kingdoms of the West. The Dark Tower was leveled to the ground, yet its foundations remained, and it was not forgotten. The Númenóreans indeed set a guard upon the land of Mordor, but none dared dwell there because of the terror and memory of Sauron, and because the mountain of fire that stood nigh to Barad-dûr, and the valley of Gorgoroth was filled with ash. Many of the elves and many of the Númenóreans and of men who were their allies had perished in the battle and the siege, and Elendil the Tall and Gil-galad the High King were no more. Never again was such a host assembled, nor was there any such league of elves and men, for after Elendil's day the two kindreds became estranged. The ruling ring passed out of the knowledge even of the wise in that age, yet it was not unmade. For Isildur would not surrender it to Eldon and Círdan, who stood by. They counselled him to cast it into the fire of Orodruin, the nigh at hand, in which it had been forged, so that it should perish, and the power of Sauron be for ever diminished, and he should remain only as a shadow of malice in the wilderness. But Isildur refused this counsel, saying, "This I will have as weregild for my father's death and my brother's. Was it not I that dealt the enemy his death blow?" And the ring that he held seemed to him exceedingly fair to look on, and he would not suffer it to be destroyed. Taking it therefore, he returned at first to Minas Anor, and planted the white tree in memory of his brother Anarion. But soon he departed, and after he had given counsel to Meneldil, his brother's son, and had committed to him the realm of the south, he bore away the ring to be an heirloom of his house, and marched north from Gondor by the way that Elendil had come. And he forsook the south kingdom, for he proposed to take up his father's realm in Eriador, far from the shadow of the Black Land. I was going to say something. Oh, destroying the ring basically just makes it so Sauron has no more foothold in the physical realm. He's not going to be able to really do anything anymore. He can't make another body without it. He's just going to be a ghost going, "Ooh, fuck you guys." Yeah. So that's why they need to get rid of the ring. It ties him to the world. But Isildur was overwhelmed by a host of orcs that lay in wait in the misty mountains. They descended upon him unawares in his camp between the greenwood and the great river, nigh to Loeg Ningaloron, the Gladden fields, for he was heedless and set no guard, deeming all his foes were overthrown. There well nigh all his people were slain, and among them his 3 elder sons, Elendor, Araton, and Sirion. But his wife and his youngest son, Valandil, he had left in Imladris when he went to war. Isildur himself escaped by means of the ring, for when he wore it he was invisible to all eyes. But the orcs hunted him by scent and slot, until he came to the river and plunged in. There the ring betrayed him and avenged its maker, for it slipped from his ring as he swam, slipped from his finger as he swam, and it was lost in the water. Then the orcs saw him as he labored in the stream, and shot him with many arrows, and that was his end. Only 3 of his people came ever back over the mountains after long wandering. One of them was Otar, his esquire, to whose keeping he had given the shards of the sword of Elendil. Thus Narsil came in due time to the hands of Valandil, Isildur's heir in Imladris. But the blade was broken, and its light was extinguished, and it was not forged anew. And Master Elrond foretold this was not to be done until the ruling ring should be found again, and Sauron should return. But the hope of elves and men was that these things might never come to pass. Valandil took up his abode in Anu Minas, but his folk were diminished, and of the Númenóreans and of men of Eriador there remained now too few people to build or maintain all the places Elendil had built. In Dagorlad and in Mordor and upon the Gladden fields many had fallen. And it came to pass after the days of Arendor, the 7th king that followed Valandil, that the men of Westernessy, the Dunedain of the north, became divided into petty realms and lordships, and their foes devoured them one by one. Ever they dwindled with the years until their glory passed, leaving only green mounds in the grass. At length naught was left of them but a strange people wandering secretly in the wild, and other men knew not their homes nor the purposes of their journeys, and save in Imladris, in the house of Elrond, their ancestry was forgotten. Yet the shards of the sword were cherished during many lives of men by the heirs of Isildur, and their line from father to son remained unbroken. So that's how the Rangers come to be. You know, that used to be there was this great kingdom in the north, the Dunedain, the descendants of the Númenóreans and the king, and they just lost so many people in the war, and then, you know, became so divided, and eventually just become wanderers in the wilderness, and that's where Aragorn comes from. In the south, the realm of Gondor endured, and for a time its splendor grew, until it recalled the wealth and majesty of Númenor ere it fell. High towers the people of Gondor built, and strong places, and havens of many ships, and the winged crown of the kings of men was held in awe by people of many lands and tongues. For many a year the white tree grew before the king's house in Minas Anor, the seed of that tree which Isildur brought out of the deeps of the sea from Numenor. And the seed before that came from Avalone, and before that from Valinor, in the day before days when the world was young. Yet at the last, in the wearing of the swift years of Middle-earth, Gondor waned, and the line of Meneldiel, son of Anarion, failed. For the blood of the Númenóreans became much mingled with that of other men, and their power and wisdom was diminished, and their lifespan was shortened, and the watch upon Mordor slumbered. In the days of Telemnar, the 3rd and 20th of the line of Meneldiel, a plague came upon dark winds out of the east, and it smote the king and his children, and many of the people of Gondor perished. Then the forts on the borders of Mordor were deserted, and Minas Ithil was emptied of its people, and evil entered again into the Black Land secretly, and the ashes of Gorgoroth were stirred as by a cold wind, for dark shapes gathered there. It is said that these were indeed the Ulari, whom Sauron called the Nazgul, the 9 ring-wraiths that had long remained hidden, but returned now to prepare the ways of their master, for he had begun to grow again. And in the days of Eärnil they made their first stroke, and they came by night out of Mordor over the passes of the Mountain of Shadow, and they took Minas Ithil for their abode, and they made it a place of such dread that none dared to look upon it. Thereafter it was called Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and Minas Morgul was ever at war with Minas Arnor in the west. So if you remember in the movie, there's that big green tower that Frodo and Sam have to come by and climb up the mountain, and it's like all creepy and a war, Minas Arnor is Gondor. When they show Gondor and there's that big, that's Minas Arnor, and then Minas Ithil was supposed to be the other side. The 2 brothers had their 2 tower kingdom things, supposed to be the other one, and now the bad guys have it. But Minas Arnor endured, and it was named anew Minas Tirith, the Tower of Guard, for the kings caused to be built in the citadel a white tower, tall and fair, and its eyes was upon many lands. Proud still and strong was that city, and in it the white tree still flowered for a while before the house of the kings, and there the remnant of the Númenóreans still defended the passage of the river against the terrors of Minas Morgul, and against all the enemies of the west, orcs and monsters and evil men, and thus the lands behind them west of Anduin were protected from war and destruction. Still Minas Tirith endured after the days of Eärnor, son of Arni. The page is faded out here. I think it's Eärnil. Until the last king of Gondor. He it was that rode alone to the gates of Minas Morgul to meet the challenge of the Morgul lord, and met him in single combat, but he was betrayed by the Nazgul and taken alive into the city of torment, and no living man saw him ever again. Eärnor left no heir, but when the line of the kings failed, its stewards of the house of Mardil the Faithful ruled the city and its ever-shrinking realm. And the Rohirim, the horsemen of the north, came and dwelt in the green land of Rohan, which before was named Cael Nardhan, and was part of the kingdom of Gondor. And the Rohirrim aided the lords of the city in their wars. And northward, beyond the falls of Rauros and the gate of Argonath, there were as yet other defences, powers more ancient, of which men knew little, against whom the things of evil did not dare to move, until in the ripening of time their dark lord Sauron should come forth again. And until that time was come, never again after the days of Eärnil did the Nazgul dare to cross the river, or to come forth from their city in shape visible to men. In all the days of the Third Age, after the fall of Gil-galad, Master Elrond abode in Imladris, and he gathered there many elves, and other folk of wisdom and power, from among all the kindreds of Middle-earth, and he preserved through many lives of men the memory of all that had been fair. And the house of Elrond was a refuge for the weary and oppressed, and a treasury of good counsel and wise lore. In that house were harboured the heirs of Isildur in childhood and old age, because of the kinship of their blood with Elrond himself. And because he knew in his wisdom that one should come of their line to whom a great part was appointed in the last deeds of the age. And until that time came, the shards of Elendil's sword were given into the keeping of Elrond, when the days of the Dunedain darkened and they became a wandering people. In Eriador, Imladris was the chief dwelling of the High Elves, but at the Grey Havens of Lindon their abode was also a remnant of the people of Gilgalad, the Elven King. At times they would wander into the lands of Eriador, but for the most part they dwelt near the shores of the sea, building and tending their elven ships wherein those of the firstborn, who grew weary of the world, set sail into the uttermost west. Círdan the shipwright was lord of the havens, and mighty among the wise. Of the 3 rings that the elves had preserved unsullied, no open word was ever spoken among the wise, and few even of the Eldar knew where they were bestowed. Yet after the fall of Sauron, their power was ever at work, and where they abode, their mirth also dwelt, and all things were unstained by the griefs of time. Therefore, ere the Third Age was ended, the elves perceived that the Ring of Sapphire was with Elrond, in the fair valley of Rivendell, upon whose house the stars of heaven most brightly shone, whereas the Ring of Adamant was in the land of Lorien, where dwelt the Lady Galadriel. A queen she was of the woodland elves, the wife of Celeborn of Doriath, yet she herself was of the Noldor, and remembered the day before days in Valinor, and she was the mightiest and fairest of all the elves that remained in Middle-earth. But the Red Ring remained hidden until the end, and none save Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan knew to whom it had been committed. Gandalf. Thus it was that in 2 domains the bliss and beauty of the elves remained, still undiminished, while that age endured, in Imladris and in Lothlorien, the hidden land between Celebrant and Anduin, where the trees bore flowers of gold, and no orc or evil thing dared ever come. Yet many voices were heard among the elves foreboding that if Sauron should come again, then either he would find the ruling ring that was lost, or at best his enemies would discover it and destroy it. But in either chance, the powers of the 3 must then fail, and all things maintained by them must fade, and so the elves should pass into the twilight, and dominion of men begin. That's why the elves' time comes to an end at the end of the films, because when the ring's destroyed, all the rings lose their power, and the power of the rings is what was keeping Rivendell and Lothlorien safe and happy and blah blah blah. Some elves stay for a while, like, I'm pretty sure the Greenland elves and stuff don't leave right away, but the elves in those lands start heading home. And so indeed it has since befallen. The 1 and the 7 and the 9 are destroyed, and the 3 have passed away, and with them the Third Age is ended, and the tales of the Eldar in Middle-earth draw to a close. Those were the fading years, and in them the last flowering of the elves east of the sea came to its winter. In that time the Noldor walked still in the hitherlands, mightiest and fairest of the children of the world, and their tongues were still heard by mortal ears. Many things of beauty and wonder remained on earth in that time, and many things also of evil and dread. Orcs there were, and trolls and dragons and fell beasts, and strange creatures old and wise in the woods, whose names are forgotten. Dwarves still labored in the hills, and wrought with patient craft works of metal and stone that none now can rival. But the dominion of men was preparing, and things were changing, until at last the Dark Lord arose in Mirkwood again. Now of old the name of that forest was Greenwood the Green. Greenwood the Great. I can't read today. The name of that forest was Greenwood the Great, and its wide halls and aisles were the haunt of many beasts and of birds of bright songs, and there was the realm of King Thranduil under the oak and the beech. But after many years, when well nigh a third of that age of the world had passed, a darkness crept slowly through the wood from the southward, and fear walked there in shadowy glades. Fell beasts came hunting, and cruel and evil creatures laid their snares. Then the name of the forest was changed, and Mirkwood it was called, for the nightshade lay deep there, and few dared to pass through, save only in the north where Thranduil's people still held evil at bay. Whence it came few could tell, and it was long ere even the wise would discover it. It was the shadow of Sauron and the sign of his return. For coming out of the wastes of the east, he took up his abode in the south of the forest, and slowly he grew and took shape there again. In a dark hill he made his dwelling, and wrought there his sorcery, and all folk feared the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, and yet they knew not at first how great was their peril. Even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at that time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the lords of the west to contest the power of Sauron if he should rise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. In the likeness of men they appeared, old but vigorous, and they changed little with the years, and aged but slowly, though great cares lay on them. Great wisdom they had, and many powers of mind and hand. Long they journeyed far and wide among elves and men, and held converse also with beasts and with birds. And the peoples of Middle-earth gave to them many names, for their true names they did not reveal. Chief among them were those whom the elves called Mithrandir and Curunir, but men in the north named Gandalf and Saruman. Of these, Curunir was the eldest and came first, and after him came Mithrandir and Radagast, and others of the Eastery who went into the east of Middle-earth and do not come into these tales. Radagast was the friend of all beasts and birds, but Curunir went most among men, and was subtle in speech and skilled in all the devices of smithcraft. Mithrandir was closest in counsel with Elrond and the elves. He wandered far in the north and west, and made never in any land any lasting abode. But Curunir journeyed into the east, and when he returned he dwelt at Orthanc in the ring of Isengard, which the Númenóreans made in the days of their power. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and its power increased, and in that time was first made the Council of the Wise, that is called the White Council. And therein were Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan, and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir and Curunir. And Curunir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel, indeed, had wished that Mithrandir should be head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place nor be subject to any summons. I love Gandalf. It's like, job? I don't want a job! I want to wander and smoke my pipe. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the Rings of Power, their making and their history. Now the shadow grew ever greater, and the hearts of Elrond and Mithrandir darkened. Therefore, on a time at great peril, Mithrandir went again to Dol Guldur and the pits of the sorcerer, and he discovered the truth of his fears and escaped. And returning to Elrond, he said, "Alas, true is our guess. This is not one of the Ulari, as many have long supposed. It is Sauron himself who has taken shape again and now grows apace. And he is gathering again all the rings to his hand, and he seeks ever for news of the one, and of the heirs of Isildur, if they live still on earth." And Elrond answered, "In the hour that Isildur took the ring and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought, that Sauron should return." "Yet the one was lost," said Mithrandir, "and while it still lies hid, we can master the enemy, if we gather our strength and tarry not too long." Then the White Council was summoned, and Mithrandir urged them to swift deeds, but Curunir spoke against him, and counselled them to wait yet and watch. "For I believe not," said he, "that the one will ever be found again in Middle-earth. Into Anduin it fell, and long ago, I deem, it was rolled to the sea. There it shall lie until the end, when all this world is broken and the deeps are removed." Therefore naught was done at that time, though Elrond's heart misgave him, and he said to Mithrandir, "None the less I forebode that the one will yet be found, and then war will arise again, and in that war this age will be ended. Indeed, in a second darkness it will end, unless some strange chance delivers us that my eyes cannot see." "Many are the strange chances of the world," said Mithrandir, "and help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter." Thus the wise were troubled, but none as yet perceived that Curunir had turned to dark thoughts, and was already a traitor in heart. For he desired that he and no other should find the great ring, so that he might wield it himself, and order all the world to his will. Too long he had studied the ways of Sauron in the hope of defeating him, and now he envied him as a rival rather than hated his works, and he deemed that the ring which was Sauron's would seek for its master as he became manifest once more, but if he were driven out again it would lie hid. Therefore he was willing to play with peril and let Sauron be for a time, hoping by his craft to forestall both his friends and the enemy when the ring should appear. He set a watch upon the Gladden fields, but soon discovered that the servants of Dol Guldur were searching all the ways of the river in that region. Then he perceived that Sauron also had learned of the manner of Isildur's end, and he grew afraid and withdrew to Isengard and fortified it. And ever he probed deeper into the lore of the rings of power and the art of their forging, but he spoke none of this to the council, hoping still he might be the first to hear news of the ring. So, he wants to find the ring. Sauron wants to find the ring. He goes to look in the river that he knows the ring fell in, and finds out Sauron's already looking, and he's like, oh shit, he knows where it is. But neither of them are going to find it, because the ring's not in the river anymore. He gathered a host of spies, and many of these were birds, for Radagast lent him his aid, divining naught of his treachery, and deeming that this was but part of the watch upon the enemy. But ever the shadow in Mirkwood grew deeper, and to Dol Guldur evil things repaired out of all the dark places of the world, and they were united again under one will, and their malice was directed against the elves and survivors of Numenor. Therefore at last the council was again summoned, and the lore of the rings was much debated, but Mithrandir spoke to the council, saying, "It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7 he has recovered 3. We must strike." To this Curunir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time, he aided the council, and they put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur, and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood for a brief while was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, for the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all his movements, and the Ulari, his 9 servants, had gone before him to make ready his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned, and ere the wise could prevent him, re-entered his kingdom in Mordor, and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. And in that year the wise council met for the last time, and Curunir withdrew to Isengard, and took counsel with none save himself. Orcs were mustering, and far to the east and the south the wild people were arming. In the midst of gathering fear and rumor of war, the foreboding of Elrond was proven true, and the One Ring was indeed found again, by a chance more strange than even Mithrandir had foreseen, and it was hidden from Curunir and from Sauron. For it had been taken from Anduin long ere they sought for it, being found by one of the small fisher-folk that dwelt by the river, ere the kings failed in Gondor. And by its finder it was brought beyond search into dark hiding under the roots of the mountains. There it dwelt until even in the year of the assault upon Dol Guldur it was found again, by a wayfarer, fleeing into the depths of the earth from the pursuit of orcs, and passed into a far distant country, even to the land of the Perianath, the little people, the halflings, who dwelt in the west of Eriador. And ere that day they had been held of small account by elves and men, and neither Sauron nor any of the wise save Mithrandir had in all their councils given thought to them. Now by fortune and his vigilance Mithrandir first learned of the ring, ere Sauron had news of it. Yet he was dismayed and in doubt, for too great was the evil power of this thing for any of the wise to wield, unless, like Curunir, he wished himself to become a tyrant and Dark Lord in his turn. But neither could it be concealed from Sauron forever, nor could it be unmade by the craft of elves. Therefore, with the help of the Dunedain of the north, Mithrandir set a watch upon the land of Perianath, and bided his time. But Sauron had many ears, and soon he heard rumor of the One Ring, which above all things he desired, and sent forth the Nazgul to take it. Then war was kindled, and in battle with Sauron the Third Age ended even as it had begun. So, those wanderers, the Dunedain, the Rangers, The entirety of the Shire has been being watched by them for something like 80 years from around the time he figured out Bilbo picked it up, and then like 60 years pass before Frodo takes the ring. So the reason they run into Aragorn and he's like, "Hey, what's up?" is because all the Rangers were around there watching out for them on Gandalf's word, saying, "Hey guys, keep an eye on the little folks." But those who saw the things that were done in that time, deeds of valor and wonder, have elsewhere told the tale of the War of the Ring, how it ended both in victory unlooked for and sorrow long foreseen. Here let it be said that in those days the heir of Isildur arose in the north, and he took the shards of the sword of Elendil, and in Imladris they were reforged. And he went then to war, a great captain of men. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the 30th heir, not 13th, the 30th, this is so hard to say, the 30th heir in the right line from Isildur, and yet more like to Elendil than any before him. Battle there was in Rohan, and Curanir the traitor was thrown down, and Isengard broken, and before the city of Gondor a great field was fought, and the Lord of Morgul, captain of Sauron, passed into darkness, and the heir of Isildur led the hosts of the west to the black gates of Mordor. In the last battle were Mithrandir and the sons of Elrond, and the king of Rohan, and the lords of Gondor, and the heir of Isildur with the Dunedain of the north. There at the last they looked upon death and defeat, and all their valor was in vain, for Sauron was too strong. Yet in that hour was put to the proof that which Mithrandir had spoken, and help came from the hands of the weak when the wise faltered. For as many songs have since sung, it was the Perianath, the little people, dwellers in hillsides and meadows, that brought them deliverance. For Frodo the halfling, it is said, at the bidding of Mithrandir, took on himself the burden, and alone with his servant passed through peril and darkness, and came at last, in Sauron's despite, even to Mount Doom. And there into the fire where it was wrought he cast the great ring of power, and so at last it was unmade, and its evil consumed. Then Sauron failed, and he was utterly vanquished and passed away like a shadow of malice. And the towers of Barad-dûr crumbled in ruin, and at the rumour of their fall many lands trembled. Thus peace came again, and a new spring opened on earth, and the heir of Isildur was crowned king of Gondor and Arnor, and the might of the Dunedain was lifted up, and their glory renewed. In the courts of Minas Anor the white tree flowered again, for a seedling was found by Mithrandir in the snows of Mindolluin, that rose tall and white above the city of Gondor, and while it still grew there, the elder days were not wholly forgotten in the hearts of the kings. Now all of these things were achieved for the most part by the counsel and vigilance of Mithrandir, and in the last few days he was revealed as a lord of great reverence, and clad in white he rode into battle, but not until the time came for him to depart was it known he had long guarded the red ring of fire. At the first that ring had been entrusted to Círdan, lord of the Havens, but he had surrendered it to Mithrandir, for he knew whence he came and whether at last he would return. Take now this ring, he said, for thy labours and thy cares will be heavy, but in all it will support thee and defend thee from weariness. For this is the ring of fire, and herewith maybe thou shalt rekindle hearts to the valour of old in a world that grows chill. But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores, guarding the havens until the last ship sails. Then I shall await thee. White was the ship, and long was it a building, and long it awaited the end of which Círdan had spoken. But when all these things were done, and the heir of Isildur had taken up the lordship of men, and the dominion of the west had passed to him, then it was made plain that the power of the three rings also was ended. And to the firstborn the world grew old and grey. In that time the last of the Noldor set sail from the havens, and left Middle-earth forever. And latest of all, the keepers of the three rings rode to the sea, and Master Elrond took the ship that Círdan had made ready. In the twilight of autumn it sailed out of Mithlond. Into the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more, and borne upon the high airs above the mists of the world, it passed into the ancient west, and an end was come for the Eldar of story and of song. And that is the end of the Silmarillion. It ends the same way that the trilogy ends, with them riding away on the boat, and it's the same boat. Círdan says the last boat will be the one we take together, and they don't I think, name him in the film, but I'm pretty sure that there's an elf in white in the film, and that's Círdan saying, "Hey, we're going. Take the rings, let's go," and Frodo gets to go with them. Other elves are still in Middle-earth. The Noldor, the ancient ones that this book was really about, they're all gone. And other people still cross across the sea. Legolas builds a boat and takes Gimli with him. I think some other folks probably go too, but those are the last of the Noldor, and that's the Silmarillion's really about them, so that's the end of their story. Thanks for listening. I can't believe we finished a whole book. We'll read more Tolkien eventually. We'll probably take a little break on him before we start another one. Maybe we'll watch the movies next week or something. We'll have to figure it out. Tomorrow will be The Ring and Persona, I believe. Or Soma, because someone did pay me to play that. I don't know if I want to keep torturing Akatsuki or not. One of those two. If you like what I do and you want to support it, links are in the description, and you can do that. Join the Discord if you want to hang out with cool people and watch the movies next week. Buy my books, all that jazz, become a member. Y'all know. Thanks so much again, and thanks to the members that are here today, like Jeff and Handsome Wretch and Daniel. You're all amazing, and Delvin, and all you guys are great. Thanks so much. We will read more soon. Until then, have a good night, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye!